Hi, George.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Let me put you to the audience. Okay. Okay. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, and again, apologies that I'm not able to be there in person. I'm experiencing, I think it's -5 Celsius this morning with the prospect of snow soon. So I'm assuming wherever you are, I would enjoy it quite a bit more than where I am currently.
Okay. Sadly, you will miss the beach party, so okay, nothing to do there.
Now
Uh,
you're just being mean.
okay. Hi, everybody. I have the pleasure to introduce you, George Siemens. His list of accomplishments is too long to mention here. I will only mention that he's one of the co-authors of the first MOOC. He also co-developed the learning theory of connectivism, and is one of the key people behind the emergence of the learning analytics as a scientific field. Uh, he's currently working at the University of Texas at Arlington. He's the executive director of the learning innovation at Networking Knowledge Research Lab. That's a mouthful. And he's also ex-president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research. Without further ado, I leave you with George. Thank you for being here.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Javier. And I'm not sure how we'd like to sort of process and work with questions. So if you can let me know what's the best way to address that, if you want me to sort of pause at a set point and just see if there's any comments from the audience, or if you'd like me to just sort of go through the presentation and do Q&A later on. Do you have a preference for how that's handled?
Due to the setting, I think it will be better to leave the questions and answers for the last, so they can come on into the computer and they can speak to you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, again, just want to say thanks again, Javier, for the opportunity here to spend a bit of time chatting with your group. And one of the sort of things I was tasked with was talking a little bit about what is happening in learning analytics as a domain. What are some of the interesting things that are happening? Where are we going? And a range of other activities. So what I'm going to do as I go sort of navigate that particular outcome is I want to spend a little bit of time first just stepping back a little bit and providing at least a partial overview of where we are overall in the education landscape and what that might mean for us going forward. And so essentially we want to sort of articulate what's happening with the opportunities around learning analytics and what they are. And so I'll step back and describe sort of my interpretation of it. With any story, there's multiple narratives. And so I'm going to start by just providing an overview of how we got to where we are with learning analytics from my perspective, and then look at some of the influencing factors, and then where I see things developing right now. So it was about 2009, a group of us got together, 2010 in that timeline, and started looking at how could we get a conversation going around analytics in education, and what would that look like? Who should be involved, and what are some of the potential outcomes of that? And so we organized a conference, and actually Javier joined us in sunny but very cold Banff to do a keynote for us at that conference. And the early indication wasn't a big group. There's about 100 people that were involved, and early indications from that conversation were that there's an enormous amount of interest in the topic of learning analytics. Now, there was a number of things going on before we showed up. So there was a paper. EDUCAUSE was an organization that was most active in advancing this. They did a number of papers on academic analytics, and most of these papers were targeted at trying to communicate some level of the ways in which business intelligence activities could be brought into the educational landscape. And so what that meant was that the approaches of analytics were as much interested in helping to organize the university as well as trying to improve the learning process. And so we took a very specific departure. There's two things we did with learning analytics three things actually that were unique. One, we wanted a research-oriented view. We didn't want sort of a, lived experiences, here's what I did, tell a story, this is the outcome. We very much wanted to hear people their experimental designs, how they plan to deploy learning analytics, what was the outcome, what was the impact cognitively, socially, and so on a number of fronts. So that was our interest with it, rather than just simply a business intelligence model applied. So that was one direct focus. The second direct focus that we had with learning analytics was that we were very interested in taking the two domains that we thought were critical. On the one hand, the technical, methodological, mathematical, computer science view of data collection, data access, and data utilization. So that was a central mission or vision for us as we started deploying things. And we were very clear. We stated that we wanted to bring these different topics together. We wanted people who were involved in computer science, who had some perhaps algorithmic capabilities, but individuals who were involved in other fields, such as education and the sociological impact and so on. So that was essentially what our challenge was with that conversation, was bringing these two separate camps together. So we wanted a research-oriented mindset. We didn't want to spend a lot of time looking at academic analytics, which is the institutional impact. We really wanted to look at the relationship between the learner, the content, and the educator. And then finally, as I mentioned, we wanted to treat these as a unified field rather than this sort of desperate, the computer scientists will work over here and publish over here, the learning scientists will work over here and publish over here. We very much wanted to bring those two camps together. So that was the original intent that we had with the first Learning Analytics conference. And then from there, it just sort of grew, and we found what was perhaps most surprising and rewarding. And we found, like I said, folks like Javier and others that were involved in either of those two domains, either the computer science or the learning sciences background. And we just found that there was a growing number of individuals that were interested in this. So we had about 100 people at the first event, and I think this last year when we held our event out in New York, or just outside of New York, we were sitting at 350 plus individuals attending. So we very much had an interesting outcome and a rapid growth cycle that happened with the analytics process as a whole. So from there, that was a little bit of a nexus or the background, what our mission and our vision was. That we wanted to make a dramatic impact on how teaching and learning happens on campuses. And in the process, we've managed to bring in a large number of related fields, which I'll address sort of in this next section, where I want to look at what is it that learning analytics is comprised of. So initially, the groups that got together were really all over the map. We had people that came from the traditional psychology to some, not as many educators as I thought from the education faculty, but we had psychologists, we had computer scientists, we had individuals that really came across all aspects of different domains of higher education. But the background of learning analytics actually, as a unique concept, is still a bit emerging, because initially we just stole, if you will, ideas and methods and approaches from every field. So one of the early prominent topic areas that we found in the Learning Analytics Conference were things like social network analysis, which was essentially a concept taken from the field of sociology, where we would incorporate different practices of understanding and evaluating what was happening with learners, and then utilize their connections as a way of understanding what was going on. We also used activities such as log analysis of the logs that are generated as learners engage with the learning management system. And so that was a data source and a method that we utilized from quite often what was happening in a lot of websites. Who clicks what and where and when, and how long do they stay on a resource? So we were early on taking analytics activity from some of the psychology, sociology, learning sciences background, and the questions of network analysis and so on that we were asking at that stage. And then secondly, we were taking a lot of the methods and the approaches that were already being utilized in computer science or web science in general, because there had been quite a bit of work around using data trails produced by users and trying to understand what was happening. That was essentially the first 2 years of the event. That was where we focused just on trying to get a little bit of an architecture of the landscape. Once we got, and Leuven really, I think, is where things started to mature. And if I'm correct, Javier, I believe you were actually the program chair as well with Leuven. So Javier he's a strand that runs through a lot of the learning analytics activity. But So in the Lumen event, we started to see some sophistication developing around learning analytics. And by sophistication, I mean we started to see more incorporation of discourse analysis techniques. We started seeing a broader assessment of the whole person learner, if you will. We started, instead of just talking about cognition as this vague entity, we started seeing some of the cognitive activities being isolated and operationalized in terms of specific questions or specific types of outcomes and so on that we were trying to target. From there, we moved to Indianapolis, and at the Indianapolis conference, we continued that trajectory of more sophisticated analytics techniques that were starting to become more unique to the idea of learning rather than just incorporated concepts that were taken from other spaces. And we also had a secondary component developing, which was the recognition of machine learning and related approaches, more of a sophisticated technical approach that was also representative of what was happening more broadly around internet development in general and how we understood user behavior and so on. And then most recently, the event that we had in New York was it became quite clear that the field of learning analytics at that conference, at least, became quite well structured around a couple of emerging themes and topic areas. So, for example, there was far more sophistication in the types of questions that we were asking. There was also greater so we were looking at things like temporal traces, how time sequencing and process mining could contribute to understanding what was happening as learners engaged in a particular area of discussion or learning activity. We also started to see a better integration with existing fields of cognitive research, so activity around how individual students regulate their own learning. We were able to incorporate the activity and, let's say, folks like Phil Winnie and psychology in general to be able to evaluate the practices of learners in those spaces and what sort of the outcome of that was. So we just became progressively more sophisticated, at least over the last couple of events, and I think that was an encouraging trajectory. And so where I see right now the learning analytics field, and there's a paper that Shane Dawson led and Dragan Gasevich and I were involved with at the 2014 conference, where we looked at the research literature and what's happening in learning analytics in terms of methodology and what are the parent disciplines of different researchers. And seeing that evolve now and mature to the point where learning analytics is no longer this cobbling together of different domains, namely we steal parts from here and here and here, we take a methodology from here, we take an approach from here, we have research questions from here, and we bring them together. Instead of that kind of an approach, it started to become something that is much more sophisticated in terms of its ability to meet the needs of researchers, and I think more importantly, its ability to impact positively the outcome of individuals in the learning sphere or the learning space in general. And so that's where we sit currently, at least at this point, where we've matured an awful lot over, especially since Leuven. That was, I think, the event where we marked a bit of a departure from utilizing analytics techniques to starting to develop some of our own. And that continued with the incorporation of machine learning and more sophisticated techniques in Indianapolis. And then now with the New York event, starting to see an entire field of specific questions around, as I mentioned, everything from time sequence to temporal behaviors to process mining and so on. So we're starting to see, I think, analytics as a field now that is on the, really at the early stages of being able to provide dramatic value back, not just to the teacher in a classroom, but sort of to the researchers, to the designers, and how they create and roll out and deploy some of the learning activities that they utilize in their classroom. More promising, we're starting to see a lot of attention being paid to the alternative data collection approaches. Much of what we've done so far has relied on the use of learning management system data, because that was easy data that we could get a hold of. But now there's recognition that, well, perhaps we need to start getting data that comes from learners engaging with different systems. We need to start getting access to distributed network data, where you might have to overlay what's happening in a learning management system with activities that are going on on the web, or real-world data. I think there's some activities we're involved with now at Link Lab in Texas, is the use of temporal, or not temporal, I should say, but contextual analytics, where we're looking at ambient computing, sensors, wearable devices, and so on. So it's becoming much more sophisticated in terms of the data collection practices that we're engaging in now, and I think that will only continue to evolve. Another thing that's been a huge plus for all of us really in the education landscape has been the utilization or the development of MOOCs. So MOOCs have essentially brought the idea of teaching and learning into a very broad conversation. So suddenly you have physics or physicists and chemists that are becoming involved in some of these activities and so on, and then that's continuing to get much more complex now that we're able to bring a lot of these other topic areas together and able to really, I think, at some level begin to provide more actionable insight rather than just simply trying to understand what's happening. We're now able to try and target what we might want to do about it. And so it's been fascinating seeing this almost a horizontal connection across the entire university campus. That's going to be a huge factor. And so what I mean with that is that we have all facets of the university represented. We have a range of questions that are both very technically and socially sophisticated that are being addressed. We're asking questions around power and relationships and so on. And all of those things are important factors for us to be aware of, and that those are some of the trajectories that we see occurring. So that's a very, very brief run through what's going on in the in the learning analytics landscape currently. I'm just going to pause briefly and then just see if there's some additional questions at this point, Javier, and then I'll dive into some additional views on practices and activities.
Okay. If you want to come up to the computer to make a question, I can translate if you don't feel too comfortable with English. Christian?
Só um ratito, Javier.
Yeah.
Bom, ele deu uma paradinha para a gente fazer perguntas assim, sobre o que a gente falou até agora, e dependendo das perguntas ele vai seguir de um lado para o outro na fala dele. Alguém gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta sobre alguma das coisas que ele comentou no momento?
Okay, sorry, Javier.
Maybe you can.
Yeah, I didn't catch the question. I'm wondering if that could be repeated. It was a little, the background audio wasn't very clear.
No, it was just a translation that if somebody have questions, but I think we have a question here.
Yes, we have one question. I'll bring the person here, and the person can ask directly to you. Okay, George? So, because we have a microphone here and the sounds. Okay.
Okay, George. The question is the next. You just talked about starting using sensory inputs as a new form of data collection. How do you realize that this kind of data can help on learning analytics?
Okay, well, thanks for that. And so I think one of the things that we've done early on, and this was a very early stage, which is that we devoted a lot of our effort to just using what's easy data that was readily available for us. And that data was quite often what we were able to draw from different tool sets where the data collection was there, partly because in many cases, the technical, to do learning analytics well, you need to have a very specific set of skill sets, especially early on. You need to be able to get a hold of data, you need to be able to work with log data, you need to be able to clean data, you need to be able to integrate data, you need to have analytics techniques and so on. And so because it's fairly sophisticated, it requires really a strong set of skills as a whole. But those skill sets were not quite as accessible to everyone. And so instead what we would end up doing was trying to use the data that was easily available that we could work with rather than more and more sophisticated data, because there's a group of individuals, often it could be an educator who might not have the technical skill sets, or it could be perhaps a computer scientist who may have the technical skill sets but might not have the familiarity with the educational theoretical principles. Now what happened then over time is that we ended up now where we're getting more sophisticated, as I tried to communicate in my short presentation. We're getting more sophisticated in our ability to work with data, and simultaneously we're starting to now develop greater methods and techniques for more sophisticated analysis of data. And so by that I mean we're able to now go out and start collecting and integrating multiple data sets. So I'll give you a few examples of what I'm hoping will happen out of some of our activity here at UT. So you're likely familiar with the challenges that exist around, or let's call it opportunities. You're looking at the opportunities that exist around using wearable devices in particular. These are still reasonably new, but they're becoming more sophisticated very quickly. So whether it's an Apple Watch or an Android device, or whether it is ambient computing where you're using beacons, just as an illustration, to track individuals' movement through a campus, whether you're trying to overlay virtual networks, the ones that we have on Facebook and other social media technologies versus the ones that we have in a physical setting. Those are some early stage areas of interesting development, is the use of analytics in those spaces. What's becoming more relevant and increasingly, I think, sophisticated is that we'll be able to add a large number of data approaches that actually incorporate wearable devices such as clothing that is able to capture heart rates and other activities, or even almost everything that we're going to be using or wearing will have some kind of data collection and data sharing capabilities. Now that has a lot of things that should worry us, but it's a privacy and ethics thing that we'll eventually have to confront and navigate over time. But for now, I'm just suggesting that we're going to have much more robust data. It'll be physiological data. It'll be biometric data. One of the activities we're engaged with now, we're using iMotions, the hardware-software package, for things like eye tracking and looking at brainwaves of learners as they're engaged in particular learning activities, where we're looking at the utilization of more sophisticated biometric data collection practices and so on. So that's what we're doing right now with some of our activity, but all of these are still very, very new. As I mentioned, much of what we've done so far has been either log data or some increased attention or recognition to data collection practices that need to happen in this regard. So anyway, we're getting more sophisticated, but we still need, both in data collection but also in terms of analytics techniques. But as we broaden our data collection practices, it's going to become far more overwhelming, the types of questions that we may be able to ask. So hopefully that answers your question.
Alguém com mais alguma pergunta que gostaria de fazer?
Thanks, George. I think it did. Okay, Christian?
I have a question myself. How far do you think we are from real applications or products that can be used in the daily life? I mean, so far we have a lot of research, but how far we are from real applications that can be used in the daily life?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I think it varies. It's a little hit and miss. So, for example, some of the early applications that exist are already being utilized by any number of companies or organizations. Universities. Some of these are like so. For example, the holy grail of learning analytics is essentially the personalization and adaptation of the learning process, meaning that it's we need to know where we're going, and we need to know what sort of our goals and our visions are, and around learning practices, and we need to know what kind of educational model we want, because learning analytics are pedagogically based, which means they have a pedagogical impact, and it's something that we need to be quite aware of. So I think we do want to do a better job with a range of those kinds of factors. Excuse me, I've got just one sec. So with those kinds of activities going on, and the recognition of the pedagogical constraints, I think we can see there's some tool sets, such as what Newton is doing, or also what McGraw-Hill and some other organizations are doing. There are a growing number of tool sets that are going to make a huge impact. And they're already being deployed to millions, if not tens of millions of learners. And that's going to continue happening. Where the specific research activities now that where they're going to start to make an impact on classrooms, that's a little less certain. So, for example, the adaptive learning technologies are in many ways software products that treat the research and the utilization of research as secondary to developing a platform that individuals can broadly use. So, and I'd say almost all major learning management system vendors now have some analytics components attached to their product offerings. And so what I mean with that is you use Blackboard and you'll have some analytics capabilities. Often you have to buy it as a separate product set, but those options are there. If you're using let's say Instructure or Canvas, again, there's some analytics capabilities that are already built into it. They're not as sophisticated necessarily as they would be in a research lab, but even then they're making good progress. What's been interesting to observe over the last couple of years in particular is that the vendors are of either learning management systems or adaptive learning software or tool sets are starting to recognize and become familiar with the prominent researchers in the space, and by becoming familiar with them, they're starting to do a better job of addressing those activities for the individual universities, or by trying to bring on that kind of talent back into their own organization. So I think that's essentially what I was looking forward to seeing this emerge, where as the vendors become more sophisticated in their offerings, the vendors become more aware of the cutting-edge researchers and begin to integrate some of their work early on into their product offerings. I think that's a very positive outcome. And so that's one aspect. The other thing is the use or the development of companies that help universities make sense of their data. We're seeing an emerging vendor ecosystem that didn't exist even 2 years ago. So you have companies like Civitas now that are doing fairly high-level work with universities across the U.S. and around the world now. And as those situations become more evolved, and there's more vendors, and you're starting to see even traditional vendors such as, let's say, you've got Oracle, or you've got Intel, or you've got other companies that are providing services to the education landscape. They're starting to bring on a range of those tool sets as well. So I guess ultimately what I'm trying to get to is some of the offerings are already in the marketplace. They were initially architected for software services, which meant the analytics took a bit of a back seat. As analytics have grown in popularity and recognition, now a growing number of those companies have become aware of the leading researchers and the activity that they're doing, and they're bringing that into their software offerings. And then the third point was that there's a growing number of companies that are now serving that marketplace, and these, whether they're startups or otherwise, they're able to help universities and academics understand their analytics or their data that they have available. So short view then after all of that is basically to say that we're already starting to see some of these analytics activities move out of labs and into different product offerings. Unfortunately, that's going to take quite a long time before that happens in a more substantive or sophisticated way. But even now, we're certainly starting to see it happen.
Thank you.
Excuse
Alguém tem mais alguma pergunta? Melhor? I have another question. During your speak, you talk about different kinds of data sources, and when the professor come here to ask the question, she asked you about wearable devices that can help us to collect data. Could you explore a little bit more about these different sources of data that can be used in learning analytics? I mean, my question is because most of the people, not most of the people, but a lot of people that is going to shifting to learning analytics come from educational data mining, the educational data mining field, and we are used to use learning management system data. So if you could explore a little bit more the possibilities of other types of other sources of data that they're not just logs from the LMS.
There we go. Okay, that's a terrific question, and I think that's really the big challenge that we face, and that we've started to address already. But you're right. A lot of this is limited data, limited log data, that we've done so far. There have been a few folks that have started to parse that log data in different ways. Again, I mentioned some of the impact of temporal or time sequencing analytics work, which is starting to help advance that at some level at least. But so if we look at that any kind of systems data is going to always be challenging because it forces a learner to do something that they regularly wouldn't do. And what we want when we're using learning analytics, if we really want to get good insight into what's happening, is what we need essentially high quality, contextually learning relevant data sets. So if we tell someone go into a learning management system and do these tasks, and they do those tasks, essentially they're not learning the way that they would regularly learn. They're learning based on how we've told them to learn, which means that even though we might have good data on that, we don't have the same level of confidence in that data because it's artificially constructed data based on the conditions that we placed on the learner, as well as software that we've tasked the learner with using in a way that we defined that they would use it. So that's sort of a very broad challenge point that I see with analytics work the way that we're doing it currently. But more specifically, the areas where I see more opportunities around broadening the data collection practices is just around getting more authentic data and getting more contextual data and getting data that broadens our understanding of learning practices. So a few examples of what that might look like. So if you're wearing any kind of a wearable, even just a watch right now, you're collecting a number of things such as biometric data points that could be relevant to the learning process. I don't know yet if they are. I don't know if we know yet if they are, but it provides us with data around things like learners' heart rate, excuse me, things like learners' movement, physical activities, and otherwise that could potentially be interesting for us to see around contextual factors. The use of wearable devices that record conversation and interaction, for example, where if you have it's just a recording device where throughout the day the conversations that you engage in and so on are being captured. Then at the end of the day, as you go to bed, those conversations are automatically transcribed, and you could wake up in the morning with an analysis of the discourse and the language, the conversation that you engaged in throughout the day. With the use of eye motions, where we're looking at eye tracking software, and these are the kind of work that, let's say, Pierre Dillenburg has done out of his lab at EPFL, where we can start to see what are the things in the learning process that capture learners. With eye tracking, you can either have somebody sit in front of a computer, or you can actually have them wear glasses as they navigate around a particular room or a particular space and so on. So there's a lot of activities going on in this regard that I think we're going to become better aware of, or at least understand a different dimension of the learning experience than what we currently understand. The use of beacons or eye beacons, and where we can then use the learner's context to send nudges and notifications to the student based on either their location or a range of other factors. That, I think, also has a potentially significant outcome, even though we're not quite clear yet on what that is. So we're sort of at that stage now where we're saying this is important, we think it's important, we don't always know why it's important, and so that's, I think, one of the difficulties with broadening the data collection capabilities. So that's just related to wearables or ambient computing, where the technologies are embedded in the environment and we are interacting with the devices that we're wearing, which could be, like I said, just something as simple as getting a notification on your phone or getting some indication in that regard. So I think that those are the kinds of activities that we want to be particularly cautious of, or at least begin to utilize and explore. Now, with that, though, there's a range of other devices or data collection opportunities that exist around our utilization of other technologies, which could be distributed tool sets that we use rather than centrally an LMS. And this is a term that Dan Southers has addressed before, but he calls these analytically cloaked data collection practices, because we don't necessarily know what's happening, and we don't necessarily know who's capturing what in the data process and the data activity. So anyway, these are just a few of the things that we're trying to, I think, do a better job of, both in terms of explicit contextual data capturing, but also more broadly in terms of data collection practices that are going to give us access to a range of things that we just simply don't currently have.
Okay, I think we can continue if no more questions.
Okay, sure. So what I'm going to do now, Abelardo, for this last section here, I'll spend about 10 plus minutes or so just talking a little bit about some of the components and the challenges around the data collection practices. And these are the kinds of things I don't think will be necessarily new to anybody on the call here, but I at least sort of want to articulate some of the activities that we're involved with in this experience, and then from there, what's involved specifically in data collection. I think that's sort of the point that I'd like to get across, or how are these learning analytics practices being deployed. So, excuse me, I've got a barky dog here at home this morning. So one of the things then that we want to start looking at is how is it that we're collecting data and interacting with that data? Namely, what is it that how are we deploying learning analytics practices within a campus? And so I think one of the views that I've shared for quite a while is that we really have this top-down and a bottom-up approach when we're engaged with learning analytics. And the top-down, bottom-up approach basically means that we have a lot of faculty already, and I suspect many of you that are attending the LACLO event sort of fit into this category. But that's that you have a number of data sets that you have access to by virtue of the kind of work that you're involved in. You may have access to tools like Shane Dawson developed Snap, which is a browser plugin tool for doing social network analysis and so on. But these are activities that you're able to engage in. You could be using observational studies or just recording data points and so on and so on. So those are the sorts of things that we're beginning now, and we're starting to become more sophisticated with or more involved with as well. But the difficulty with that is that as we're involved with those activities and sort of broadening some of the data collection approaches, we have limited control, and that means that we're dealing, as I said, with this bottom-up data collection approach. We might have access to data that we're either we will have access to data that we're collecting, and we might have access to some limited log data. But this is, from a bottom-up analytics perspective, we don't have a lot of opportunity to act on it, because in many cases what happens with learning analytics approaches is that we need a more sophisticated way of understanding what's happening. We need to have institutional practices that will allow us the ability to start to support learners in a more meaningful way. So it's not sufficient, for example, that we know how or which students are at risk. It's that we actually have to have a way or an approach or something that allows us to better answer the questions that we're facing. So, and this is the shortcoming of the bottom-up approach, which is we have passionate, motivated, interested faculty members, but unfortunately those passionate, motivated faculty members don't have the automated, the access to automated intervention system, or even the ability to direct students to specific services on campus and so on. And so that's where the second part comes in from an analytics end, which is, whereas bottom-up is classroom level, often driven by an individual faculty member, and quite often is focused on a smaller type of data. Where we really want to get to, excuse me, in our analytics practices is something that comes at it from a top-down level. We need both. It's not that one is desirable over the other necessarily, but each of them do serve a very different kind of an impact. So when we're talking about a top-down level, we essentially have integrated data sources. A lot of the things we're just talking around, wearable computers and wearable devices and ambient computing. But at this point, quite often, we have a coordinated team, not just a single faculty member that's doing the analytics work. We also have a data set that's substantive, meaning that we might have tens, instead of having, let's say, a few hundred gigabyte, or having a few gigabyte, we might be looking at hundreds of gigabytes or more of student data, and that data could quite often include student information system data. It could include where we can utilize that to build predictive models to determine who may or may not be at risk of not completing a course based on a variety of other factors. We can also start to use automated discovery techniques where we can sort of explore with a large enough data sets what exists in that data and what that might mean for us in terms of learners or related learner success, and the list goes on and on and on. There's a number of things like that we're involved with that we need to spend more time thinking about once we're at the top-down level, because now we can create models, we can create predictive models, we can create recommender systems for courses to take next, pathways to take next, and so on. So I think that's something where I've seen an awful lot of activity at the bottom up, where it's a faculty member, and as I mentioned, many of you at this event probably fit into the bottom-up category. The top-down category requires institutional visions, and somebody has to take the lead, somebody has to allocate the resources, somebody has to devote the time to building out these adaptive models or systems or approaches to the teaching and learning process. And unfortunately, I haven't seen very many systems that have done that part well. I've seen a number that want to do it. They're aspirational, but they aren't really at that level yet. And so that's just a small point of clarification around learning analytics deployment requires both of those dimensions, and unfortunately the biggest impact of learning analytics for improving the experience of learners and the success of individuals is going to be from a top-down, bottom-up integrated approach, and yet we've seen very few that have done that effectively as a system. And then, excuse me, then the other thing that's worth focusing on is that the utilization of analytics. There's a paper that I did with Shane Dawson and Grace Lynch a while ago, where we were looking at the ways in which analytics can be used to improve just the competitiveness. We were looking at this in the Australian higher education sector, but we basically wanted to better understand ways in which these systems could improve their functionality based on how they use learning analytics. And so one of the things we introduced in that particular paper, and the paper is called Improving the Quality and Productivity of the Higher Education Sector, and I'll just drop a link in here. I think I should be able to drop a link somewhere into, oh yeah, there it is. There, that should come up as a link. Oh, that just gives you the whole Google report. Anyway, so that's the first link that'll come up on this, and that was a paper where our primary interest again was in just trying to define how individuals systems are deploying analytics and their sophistication approach. So we looked at a large number of universities and how they were involved with learning analytics as an organizational practice for improving teaching and learning, but sort of some of the limited scope and scheme of what they were doing. And so as a result of that, we produced what we're calling the learning analytics maturity model. And we found that and so there's basically 5 stages in the model. A system that's aware or that started to experiment with analytics is low-level maturity. Systems that have started to work at teaching dashboards and looking at system-wide data integration and so on, where you have the faculty and the students more involved and better feedback to both of them. And then ultimately the transformation of an organization, and at a national level in some areas, the sector-wide transformation. Now, broadly speaking, almost every system that I've looked at sits at that lower level. They're not very sophisticated yet in their use of analytics. Almost all of them have something that looks much more like limited data set or limited utilization of their resources. So as a result of that, we're seeing from a sophistication and extremely rudimentary or extremely limited kinds of outcomes. Early indications, I think, are that as systems get more familiar with their data and they develop their team-based capabilities, that we will start to see more sophisticated approaches, more involved learning analytics mechanisms, where we use learning analytics to help students regulate their own learning, where we use learning analytics to give the ability for designers to understand which parts of their learning activities they've designed are being well received and contributing to cognitive gains of learners, but also where we're starting to see more of a utilization of a system-wide integration and data collection and so on. But at this point, as I mentioned, very, very few systems. I think I can maybe think of one, and it's a for-profit system that has actually moved beyond basic level awareness and experimentation to something that's a little bit more sophisticated. So quite often, we're dealing with a very underdeveloped landscape with extremely limited utilization of techniques. This gets back to the question that was asked earlier about when are we going to start to see some of these products appear in the education landscape, because right now a lot of these interesting things are more research-oriented practices that haven't yet made their way into broad utilization. And I think that very much is the case around sophistication techniques, that they're so limited so far in terms of how learning analytics are actually impacting practices on that campus. And there's a lot of development work that needs to happen for us to do a better job with that. That's the analytics maturity model. The final thing I just want to talk about a little bit here over the last couple minutes before we go back to Q&A is I just want to talk about the idea of open learning analytics. And this is something that we did a paper with the Society for Learning Analytics Research a number of years ago, and I'll try and dig up the link here in a bit and drop it in later on. But one of the things that we found was that the challenges with the use of analytics, because analytics are becoming a very prominent component of most university practices, and as a result of that prominence, we are actually seeing a lot of companies that are building proprietary systems around their, so I just dropped the link in, but a lot of companies are building proprietary systems where we don't know what's happening. We can't validate the results that they say they're getting. We can't dive deeper into focused Q&A and related activity and so on. So that's, I think, really the big problem that I see us facing right now around learning analytics is that even though we have more sophistication in a lot of cases, a lot of the vendors we don't have access to an open space for these kinds of data collection practices. And what I'm a little worried about is that if we're making a lot of decisions based on our analytics outcomes, that we've essentially given up a large part of our ability to control what that looks like. So the way we've described is that we would like to see the development of a platform that is similar to what, for analytics, what a tool set like the Apache tool set has done for the web. And by making this available for others broadly, that it'll have a significant impact on the maturation of analytics practices, transparent algorithms. So if a company comes in and says, these are the results that we're getting with our tool sets, that there's an ability for us to actually validate that. So right now, if a vendor comes into any of your universities or campuses, they'll say, we have these and these and these approaches and outcomes. Then you'll say, well, can I have a look at the algorithm? I mean, what was underpinning it? Is this a quality kind of a whatever you want to call it assessment? Are these results real? In many cases, we don't have the ability to see that, because the company is going to say, well, it's proprietary software. And by taking the proprietary route, we essentially lose any ability to have meaningful comment or whatever you want to call it on that kind of data and that kind of data work. And so in order for us to validate the work that others are doing, but also to create an ecosystem where if, let's say, someone like Javier is working on one type of analytics tool set and I'm working on another tool set with my lab over here, then we need to find a way to integrate those so that we can take advantage of one another's work. We don't want to have to duplicate work. So if Javier creates an entirely different set of call sequences for deploying his software, if it's a standalone piece of software, I'm doing the same thing over here. We're both wasting a lot of effort. If you consider, for example, one of the things that makes WordPress and any of these other systems so effective is that if you have a core platform developed, then each time you want to add new functionality, as long as you design your new widgets or your new plugins according to the the architecture of the software, you can add new functionality to an existing site without having to do a lot of writing of new code. You can basically take the WordPress platform and add a new commenting system, or you can take the WordPress platform and add a new way of managing and handling spam. So I think that's exactly what we need in the learning analytics space, is some way where if somebody's doing network analysis, someone's doing discourse analysis, that we have an open learning analytics platform that allows all of us to take advantage of our shared learning activities, and rather than duplicating a lot of the software development for deployment, we can instead just generally follow the the guidelines for integration with that core open learning analytics platform. And then more importantly, we have the ability to validate the results and the comments that vendors are providing to us on the outcome of their platform or the success of their platform. So I think on that note, I'm going to leave it there, and I believe we may have a bit of time for Q&A if any exists. So Javier, over to you.
Okay, I give a chance to the audience. Okay, let's start till people come to the podium. I have a, well, you will get this question very often. But if you are really interested in learning analytics and you're in an institution, you're in, let's say, my university, and I want to start to do something with learning analytics at two levels. How do you start doing research in learning analytics, and how do you start to make practices in your own university about learning analytics? Some guidelines?
Sure. No, it's a terrific question, and I think it's one that would be very very valuable for individuals to think about, because it's relevant. I mean, really, where do you start? So I think one of the first things is recognize that there are a number of communities that are exploring this already. So probably the first one out there would be the educational data mining community. That was Ryan Baker, I think, was the founding president of that organization. Well, I know he was the founding president of that organization. And so they have annual conferences and events for that community that are certainly worth attending and being involved in. They also have a journal that you can follow as well. It's an open access journal, so you can connect with a lot of their research and so on quite easily. So I think that's probably, taking a look at communities like that. The one that I've been involved with, and I know Javier as well, is the Society for Learning Analytics Research, or SOLAR. Similarly, we have an annual conference, we have an open access journal, we have a number of regional events that we've run in the past, we have summer institutes that we run on learning analytics and so on. So I think I'd say, get started with that, with either IEDMS or with SOLAR, and look at the conferences and look at the journals and the publications that come out of those venues. The other aspect that's worth looking at is certainly doing a better job of, well, maybe better job is the wrong word, but taking advantage of some of the free learning that's available. So there's a number of MOOCs that have a learning analytics focus. There's one that's running on Coursera right now. I believe it's called Practical Learning Analytics, which is something that's come out of, I believe Michigan leads that one. Ryan Baker runs a MOOC called Big Data in Education. It's reasonably technical MOOC, and it can be a bit challenging to go through, but it's certainly useful to engage in that. So those are other options to look at. Join the Society for Learning Analytics. It's a professional organization. That's, I think, a good opportunity. Also, we have a Google group that you can join just to be involved in some of the conversations that are happening and so on. So those are just some professional development opportunities that might be of interest to members at this event. Specifically, I think more and more I'm inclined to say that we need a team-based approach with learning analytics. It's not an individual genius kind of a view, because there's so much that's involved in getting the data, cleaning the data, analyzing the data, interpreting it, visualization of that data. There's so much that happens around all of these practices that I'm less convinced that it's something that an individual should do alone. I'm much more convinced that if you want to get started with learning analytics, take a team-based approach. Find a few faculty on campus or a few staff on campus that are interested in learning analytics, and they're there, because I've seen every campus I've been involved with. As I mentioned earlier, you have that bottom-up cohort of faculty or staff that are doing some level of analytics work. So connect with a few, and one of the things I've found quite successful actually is campuses that have set up, for lack of a better word, a small-scale learning analytics deployment activity, meaning that they might have a few people that are involved with learning analytics, and they just create a sort of a community of practice, almost, if you will. They meet regularly, and this is how some of the University of Michigan work started, and Michigan is now certainly one of the more advanced groups in terms of the analytics deployment, but it really started through small group activity, which was eventually then supported by provost and so on. So from a research end, I'd suggest start there. You start with the literature, start with the communities, and from a practical end, I would say start connecting with folks on campus, having these conversations. It can be lunchtime conversation, which I've seen happen with a number of venues already, or groups where Harvard, for example, they started with, once a month or every couple of months, they would do an evening talk on the Harvard campus and bring a few folks in to start having those conversations. So I think in all cases, it's joining the professional communities, but it's also starting to experiment and connect with locally, so that you can start making some progress around your data utilization on campus.
Thank you, George. Some question from the audience? Christian?
Over here, there are no more questions.
Okay, then. The only thing that I left to do is thank you, George, for your time. I know that it's valuable for all of us. So we are honored to have you. I think you have raised a lot of interest questions in the minds of the people here. And the only thing that we could send you here is a lot of heat and good wishes to call the U.S. right now.
Good. Well, Javier, it's always a pleasure connecting with you, and again, I do apologize that things didn't work out to be physically present there, but I appreciate being able to engage with you and to have some of these conversations, and look forward to future interactions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day in the event.
Oh, thank you very much, George. And
I'll try just to change a little bit so that
okay.
the audience.
Okay.
Well, join me in thanking George.
All right. Good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Christian. Gracias.
That's it. We'll continue. Bueno, nosotros continuamos desde aquí. ¿Ya?
Ok, listo. Me
Un
dices cualquier
abrazo.
cosa.
Gracias por todo,
De nada.
Javier.
Hasta luego.
Chao.